Nobody saw it coming. That is the part that keeps replaying in the minds of everyone who was inside that stadium when it happened. Not the brawl itself. Baseball has seen brawls before, has absorbed them into its long history as moments of raw tension that occasionally boil over into something ungovernable. Those happen. They get reviewed. They get punished. The sport moves on. But this one was different. This one had Shohei Ohtani at the center of it. And when the dust settled, when the benches had cleared and the umpires had restored whatever order was left to restore and the stadium had exhaled its collective shock, two Padres players were facing something far more severe than a suspension. They were facing the kind of consequence that ends careers. The kind that doesn't have an appeal date circled on a calendar or a return timeline being quietly negotiated behind closed doors. They were facing removal from Major League Baseball entirely. The sport woke up the next morning staring at a decision of historic weight. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, the investigations, the statements, the media coverage that spread across every platform simultaneously, Shohei Ohtani stepped to a microphone and said something that nobody expected. Not anger. Not retaliation. Not the escalation that the moment seemed to be demanding from its central figure. Something bolder than all of that. To understand how the night arrived at that moment, you have to go back to the beginning of the tension. Because brawls at this level don't erupt from nothing. They build. They accumulate through innings and at-bats and pitches that sail too far inside and words exchanged at volumes that microphones don't fully capture and glances held a half-second too long across the diamond. The Padres and the Dodgers carry history between them. This is not a rivalry that lives only in the standings. It lives in the memory of both dugouts, in the way players from each side approach games against the other with an edge that doesn't exist in the same form against the rest of the division. There is respect in it. There is also something harder than respect. And on this night, that harder thing broke through the surface. The sequence of events that led directly to the brawl has been reconstructed in detail by multiple outlets, examined frame by frame in the footage that spread immediately across social media and broadcast networks. The specifics of exactly what was said and by whom remain partially disputed, that is the nature of these moments, where everything happens simultaneously and memory is colored by allegiance and adrenaline. What is not disputed is what happened to Ohtani. What is not disputed is that the two Padres players at the center of the incident crossed a line that the league's investigation determined could not be explained away as competitive heat or routine baseball confrontation. What they did, and the league was precise and deliberate in its language when it described what they did, constituted conduct that MLB could not allow to exist inside its game without consequence of the most serious kind. The process that followed was swift by the standards of institutional decision-making. Investigations that might normally stretch across weeks were compressed. Statements were gathered. Footage was reviewed from every available angle. And when the league emerged from that process, it emerged with a verdict that landed on the sports world like something that hadn't been seen in a generation. 2 players. Gone. Not suspended. Not fined. Not warned with the implicit understanding that the next incident would carry heavier consequences. Gone. The reaction moved through the baseball world in waves. The first wave was shock. Pure and simple and immediate, the kind of shock that empties a room of all its prepared opinions and leaves people reaching for something solid to hold onto while the news settles into reality. Players who had been preparing to comment on the game itself found themselves being asked questions they hadn't anticipated. Managers who had press conferences mapped out in their heads had to discard those maps entirely and navigate something unprecedented. The second wave was debate. Because a decision of this magnitude never arrives without fracture lines. There were voices, serious, credentialed voices who know this sport deeply, who said the league had gotten it right. That there are actions which cannot be absorbed into the normal disciplinary framework without permanently diminishing what that framework is supposed to protect. That sending a message in a moment this visible, involving a player this significant, was not only justified but necessary. There were other voices who pushed back. Who talked about proportionality. who raised questions about process and precedent and the long-term implications of a decision made under the pressure of a situation that had generated enormous public attention. These voices did not defend what the two players had done. But they asked, carefully and with evident discomfort, whether the response matched the act or matched the moment. That debate was still running at full volume when Ohtani walked to the microphone. The room that received him was not a normal press conference room. Normal press conferences have a rhythm, a protocol, a set of understood expectations that govern both the questions and the answers. This room had none of that. This room had the electric uncertainty of people who genuinely did not know what they were about to hear. Ohtani settled himself in front of the microphone with the stillness that is one of his most disarming qualities in public settings. He does not perform composure. He simply has it. And on a night when composure was the rarest thing in the building, it made him the most commanding presence in the room before he had said a single word. He was asked, directly, about the incident. About what had happened on the field. About the two players who had been removed from the league. About how he felt standing at the center of a night that had produced consequences this severe. He took a breath. And then he said something that made the room forget, for a moment, every prepared question on every notepad. He said he did not want this. Not the ejections, not the investigation, not the removal of two players from the game. He said that whatever had happened on that field, and he chose his words here with visible care, baseball was bigger than any single incident and the people inside it deserved to be treated with that understanding. He said he had not asked for the protection of a historic punishment. He had not lobbied for it, had not encouraged it, had not sat in anyone's office and argued for the outcome that the league ultimately delivered. He said, and this is the part that the American media grabbed and would not let go, that he hoped the two players found their way back to the game. Not back to this game, not back to these uniforms or these rosters or this rivalry. But back to baseball. In some form. In some context. Because baseball is what they are, and removing that entirely from a person is a weight he said he would not wish on anyone. The room did not immediately react. It processed. And then the questions started coming faster than the moderator could manage them. Bold is a word that gets used carelessly in sports media. Players say bold things constantly, predictions, guarantees, declarations of supremacy that are designed to generate a clip and a headline and are forgotten within the week. The machinery of sports content production has trained everyone inside it to reach for that word and apply it liberally to things that are not particularly bold at all. What Ohtani said was actually bold. Because the easier path, the path that every media advisor and communications professional would have mapped out for him, was simple. Express that he was shaken. Express confidence in the league's process. Thank the officials for their swift response. Say something vague about the importance of protecting players. Exit the room. That path exists because it works. It generates the right headlines, produces the right image, closes the story cleanly without creating new complications. Ohtani didn't take it. He took the path that required something harder than a careful statement. He took the path that acknowledged the humanity of the people who had wronged him. He stood at the microphone in the aftermath of a night that had centered his injury and his experience and his significance to the sport, and he pointed the conversation back toward something other than himself. That is not what the room expected. That is not what the overnight coverage had been predicting. And that gap between expectation and reality is precisely why the statement traveled as far and as fast as it did through the American sports media landscape. By the following morning, Ohtani's words had been translated, discussed, quoted, and analyzed across every major outlet that covers baseball and several that don't typically bother. The sports talk programs that open their broadcasts with controversy found themselves in the unusual position of leading with grace instead. The highlight packages that normally organize themselves around the physical drama of the brawl kept returning to the press conference. To the microphone. To the stillness before he spoke and the quiet that followed. Columnists who have covered this sport through decades of scandals and controversies and landmark decisions wrote with an openness that is not always their default register. They wrote about what it means to be the most visible player in the sport at the precise moment when the sport is forced to confront its own limits. They wrote about the difference between having power and knowing what to do with it. They wrote about Ohtani. Not the player who hits the ball to distances that require recalibration. Not the pitcher whose stuff generates exit velocity numbers from the other side of the plate. The person. The one who stood in a room full of people waiting for him to be angry and gave them something they were not prepared to receive. Two Padres players woke up that morning facing a reality they could not have fully anticipated when they arrived at the stadium the night before. The decisions that led them there are their own, and the accounting for those decisions belongs to them. But Shohei Ohtani woke up that morning having done something that the sport will not forget quickly. He was given a moment that rewards bitterness. A moment where hardness would have been understood and perhaps even applauded. A moment where nobody would have blamed him for pointing at the scoreboard of what had been done to him and letting it speak for itself. He looked at that moment.